Hey everyone, it's Richard. You're watching The Plain Bagel. As you probably heard, this week we got the update around the US-Canada trade war that after 2 days of being in full force, the US has once again announced a delay of some tariffs, specifically around automobiles and goods included in the USMCA agreement, with the taxes being kicked down the road for another month for roughly 40% of Canada's exports. And with the country trying to deal with the whiplash from its volatile on-again, off-again trade partner, and a trade war still very much in action, with US tariffs still in force and Canada not backing off of its own retaliatory tariffs, there's been an interesting idea circulating within Canada about how the country could become more self-sufficient. A potential solution of sorts that could help the country lessen the blow of tariffs from its largest trading partner, with the solution being buying and selling more goods and services internally. Now, I get it. On the surface, saying we'll just trade more stuff between ourselves, it probably sounds more like a cope than a sophisticated economic response to tariffs. And to be clear, in the short term, there's not a whole lot Canada can do to ease its reliance on the United States. But all this discussion of trade wars has led provinces in Canada to take a good hard look at their own trade practices and policies to see if there's any slack that could be picked up. And boy, oh boy, slacks there are, with many Canadians discovering that trade between provinces in Canada is too damn inefficient. So much so that at times it's actually easier to sell products from Canada to the European Union than it is to the province next door. With these trade barriers estimated to be costing the Canadian economy hundreds of billions of dollars annually, which is actually greater than the estimated cost of the US trade war against Canada, meaning effectively that Canada is inflicting a similar degree, if not greater amount of economic damage to itself as the US tariffs against the country. Which raises the question, why is trading in Canada so inefficient? And what can be done about it? Well, we've actually got some updates on that front, with provincial premiers recently banding together to address these barriers in the face of the US trade war. And today we'll cover the situation, discussing how we got to this point and what's being done about this uniquely Canadian problem. But first, let's start off with a high-level overview of interprovincial trade in Canada. As you might expect, internal trade is a pretty important aspect of Canada's economy, because while provinces do operate with some degree of self-sufficiency, having their own provincial governments, they do have various specialties. The prairies, for example, are key agricultural provinces. The Maritime's an important seafood exporter. Ontario produces many manufactured products, including automobiles. And Prince Edward Island produces 20% of the country's potatoes, despite only representing 0.00006% of the country's surface area. They also have great ice cream. And outside these more reputational industries, a lot of business activity crosses internal borders at some point within Canada, with a recent survey by Stats Canada finding that 41% of companies bought goods and services from another province, while 26.9% sold goods and services in another province. And last year, Canada saw the exchange of over $530 billion worth of goods and services across internal borders, representing almost 20% of Canada's gross domestic product. And we could expect this activity to naturally increase in the face of US tariffs. However, it's worth highlighting that even despite this amount of activity, it's still less trade activity than Canada has with the United States, with over $1 trillion of goods and services crossing the Canada-US border in 2024. As for why provinces trade more with the United States than one another, there are a few reasons, such as the specific industries they focus on, but a big part is that at times, it's easier to do so. With the seen interprovincial trade barriers on everything from cars to construction, chicken to cheese, Chardonnays to casks, cows to crinkle cuts. Or potatoes, I just wanted a C word. Now, unlike what we're seeing with the United States, these trade barriers don't entail literal tariffs, given that provinces are actually prohibited from using tariffs amongst one another under Canada's constitution. Nonetheless, they do lead to a material cost, with some estimates putting the tariff equivalent cost of these trade barriers somewhere between 6.9 and 21%, which, to put that into perspective, compares to Canada's average tariff rate on international imports of just 1.4% in 2022. And while the severity of these barriers varies by industry, some of the most heavily impacted industries are pretty important ones, including food products, heavier metals, and other manufacturing goods, with consumer costs estimated to be at least 7% higher as a result of these barriers, vehicles estimated to be thousands of dollars more expensive, and grocery bills estimated to be $200 higher annually directly as a result of these barriers, which again is estimated to be costing the country $200 billion in lost commerce annually, which probably leads you to wonder, what the hell is Canada doing to blunder this badly on internal trade? Well, some of the trade barriers faced by Canadian provinces are just inherent and not something that's easily addressed. Things like, for example, distance. Canada is a massive country, and St. John's is actually closer to Portugal than it is to British Columbia. So that's always going to add a bit of transportation costs when talking about interprovincial trade. But that 21% tariff equivalent cost that we referenced earlier is actually for non-geographic barriers, meaning that there are other factors here meaningfully contributing to the cost of trade. And the issue here is that it's not just one culprit. Each province and territory has pretty meaningful jurisdiction over the rules and regulations that govern trade within their borders. So in addition to any red tape or bureaucracy you might have at the federal level, each province itself can introduce their own barriers. And that's exactly what we've seen, with the first set of barriers here being protectionism and supply management. Much like how other countries themselves might employ tariffs or other protectionist measures to safeguard domestic producers and insulate them from foreign competition, we've seen provinces employ similar tactics, because while tariffs themselves are prohibited, there are other methods provinces have used to control trade. With one of the clearest examples of this being employed being for the alcohol industry. In Canada, the sale of alcohol is controlled by province and territory-owned liquor boards that often restrict the sale of alcohol from other provinces in favor of local producers, which leads to some pretty tiresome barriers. For example, if you live in Ontario, you can't purchase beer directly from a Quebec brewery, despite the fact that, especially in places like here in Ottawa, you're literally just a bridge away. Beer can only be purchased from Quebec within Quebec itself, with there only recently being a lifting of restrictions of how much beer you can bring across the border for personal consumption. Or alternatively, you can only purchase the beer within Ontario if the brewer happens to have an arrangement with the Ontario Liquor Board, the LCBO, to sell within their stores, which actually add a markup to the price. Meanwhile, on the flip side, as highlighted by the Globe and Mail, it's easier for an Ontario winery to send their products to Europe than to Quebec. Factors that make Canada the only significant wine-growing country that doesn't primarily drink its own wine. Now again, that all just has to do with alcohol, which is perhaps one of the worst examples we have of interprovincial trade barriers. But there are other staple industries that are pretty meaningfully impacted by these barriers. For example, Canada employs a pretty controversial supply management system around important industries like dairy, poultry, and egg production, meaning that the country restricts how much of these products can be produced, with each province operating under its own quota system, something that naturally makes interprovincial trade pretty complicated. The supply management is also the root of the recent social media claims that Canada currently charges ridiculous tariffs on US dairy, poultry, and egg products, which is misleading. Most trade between the countries is duty-free, and steep tariffs only apply in certain areas when the trade amount surpasses a certain set threshold or quota, with the purpose of that being to prevent Canada from being flooded with products from a country that has nearly 10 times the population, with the US still managing to have a trade surplus against Canada in dairy. Nonetheless, it is still a form of protectionism that even internally causes frictions. And in addition to these barriers targeted at really bolstering domestic production, we've also seen politically motivated barriers at times. In 2018, for example, we saw Alberta, which is Canada's main oil producing province, and British Columbia, one of the more progressive provinces, really butt heads over the development of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, with Alberta imposing a temporary ban on BC wine after the province called for a further review of the project. So as you can see, much like the trade war with the United States, some of these trade barriers have emerged out of self-interest from these provinces that have ultimately hampered overall trading activity. And these moves are naturally pretty explicit or active choices from the provinces. But the second set of trade barriers here, and perhaps the more obstructive factor in causing this friction with interprovincial trade, is actually unintentional or otherwise perhaps even unknown by the provinces trading here, with that being regulatory misalignment. You see, over time, the independent development of rules and regulations by provinces for their own trade activity has led to discrepancies or gaps in how different provinces trade, with these discrepancies materially increasing the cost of trading products and services once they cross a provincial border. With one of the most visible and stretching examples of this being for transportation. Freight trucks are responsible for the vast majority of interprovincial trade in Canada, and yet truckers face different rules when they cross provincial borders that inhibit or increase the cost of their activity. With, according to the Canadian Trucking Alliances, this including differing driver qualifications for long combination vehicles, variations in trailer registration validity periods, 60-foot 6-inch semi-trailers not uniformly accepted across Canada, differing weight allowances for self-steer quad semi-trailers depending on tire size, varying caps on the maximum sizes of tow trucks, burdensome and non-harmonized oversized/overweight permitting processes, absence of a national oversized/overweight corridor, non-uniform winter road maintenance standards, insufficient access to rest areas, and inconsistent oversight and monitoring of trucking companies, among other issues. With these barriers estimated to add 8.3% to the cost of transporting goods across provinces. So right away, you can see why trade between provinces is more expensive when just naturally everything that has to be moved across the province faces this higher expense because of these barriers. But transportation is far from the only industry that's faced with these regulatory misalignments. Industries ranging from vehicle manufacturing to food production face varying rules that require slight customizations and adjustments that make selling these goods and services to other provinces more expensive. As a visible example of this, we have Quebec, which has language protection laws that not only require companies to change packaging, documentation, and products themselves to make French the predominant language, but even has requirements in terms of how employees communicate, which naturally affects labor mobility for those who don't speak French. And while in that case, there is a motivation of protecting the French language within Canada, most of these inconsistencies are merely a result of policy redundancies, with there being, for example, over 600 professional credentialing bodies across Canada. Even in finance, each province in Canada has its own securities regulator compared to the United States, which has the one Securities Exchange Commission. To take myself as an example, you can see that I'm currently registered to give financial advice in Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Saskatchewan, but currently not next door in Manitoba. Now that's just because we haven't had any clients from Manitoba come up, but I'll work on it. And I really can't emphasize how ridiculous some of these discrepancies are. We have different rules for everything from coffee creamer packaging to the type of toilet seat that you're allowed to have on construction sites. And again, it's not that these barriers are intentional, but as every province builds out its own set of rules and regulations, there are going to be these frictions that arise. Now, thankfully, Canada has made some attempts over time to reduce these trade barriers. In 2010, for example, we saw British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba sign the new West Partnership Trade Agreement that sought to eliminate trade barriers between the provinces to improve trade, investment, and labor mobility by allowing for things like, for example, the mutual recognition of certifications from member provinces, with us similarly having a handful of other trade agreements between various provinces. And as recently as 2017, we saw the signing of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which itself sought to improve trade freedom by moving away from the positive list mechanism of the previous agreement on internal trade, whereby the rules for each industry are laid out only for those explicitly listed areas, and moving towards a negative list, meaning conversely, all industries would be subject to the agreement unless otherwise indicated. The issue, however, is that the list of exceptions on the Canadian Free Trade Agreement is pretty large, with nearly a third of the 334-page agreement including exemptions at the time of the signature. Now, over time, we have seen provinces slowly whittle away at this list of exceptions so that today it's much lesser than it used to be in terms of what's actually being implemented. But a big part of the reason why we still have this list of exceptions to begin with is that, as highlighted by a 2019 Canada West Foundation report, we don't really know the extent of these trade barriers, given, as kind of shown, the niche nature of all of them and the specific industries and areas that they apply to. And B, there hasn't been much political will to tackle these barriers, given that it could be popular to suggest that different industries open these barriers, given that could lead to further competition, and certain industries are bound to shrink within different provinces as they face heightened competition. There will be costs associated with that and unnecessary retraining of the labor force. And some of the industries and provincial institutions that contribute to these trade barriers are also key revenue sources, with the liquor boards being a prime example of that, given that they're actually owned by the provincial governments. So as you can see, it's a really messy issue. So what can be done about it? Well, naturally, some of these issues are going to be stickier and more political than others, with the Quebec language barrier being a prime example. Quebec has long fought to maintain its French culture amongst its Anglophone neighbors, to the point that the province was a hair away from separating from Canada back in 1995 with a referendum vote. Transportation is also going to be a bit of a pain point when, again, you consider that areas like Toronto are a bridge away from the United States versus thousands of kilometers away from other cities in Canada. However, as provincial politicians are coming to realize, other issues do present pretty low-hanging fruit, and we've had a number of proposed solutions for easing these trade barriers. With the Canada West Foundation, for example, recommending that Canada make an independent internal trade bureau to conduct research, collect data, and carry out comparative analysis of these trade barriers and make this data available to encourage political will, especially given that most of these issues will have to be dealt with at the provincial level versus, say, by a federal mandate. And the foundation also recommends that the government properly create, fund, and help organize domestic trade missions, similar to trade missions you might see a government carry out with international partners. Meanwhile, as highlighted by RBC, some of the commonly cited solutions include standardizing trucking requirements, mutually recognizing professional credentials, and removing restrictions on the sale of goods and services between provinces. And the Macdonald-Laurier Institute recommends that instead of focusing on regulatory harmonization, whereby all the provinces would try to align their regulations, that we instead focus on this principle of mutual recognition, whereby products and services that meet the regulatory requirements of one jurisdiction are automatically deemed to satisfy those of another. Something that, ironically, Canada already has experience utilizing with its comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the European Union. Again, highlighting why at times it's actually easier to trade with other countries than between provinces. And the good news, the silver lining with the trade war with the United States, is that this has offered the kick in the butt at the provincial level for politicians to look more into this issue. In just the last few weeks, we've seen the Canadian federal government announce that it would be removing more than half of its own exceptions to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, meaning that the government will have ultimately removed 64% of the initial exceptions included in the agreement back in 2017. And we've seen provincial premiers vowing to collaborate and ultimately address these trade barriers in the face of the US trade war, with a number of provinces removing or working on removing their own trade barriers, and Nova Scotia specifically tabling first of its kind legislation that would effectively remove its own trade barriers, allowing for the mutual recognition of regulations around manufactured goods and service provider certifications in cases when provinces reciprocate that mutual recognition. Even in the area of alcohol, most provinces have agreed to removing barriers, something that Canada's Internal Trade and Transport Minister Anita Anand has said would lead to direct-to-consumer sales in some jurisdictions within weeks, meaning finally, you'll be able to direct order that Quebec beer in Ottawa. With Anand further highlighting that removing these trade barriers within Canada would lower prices by up to 15%, boost productivity by up to 7%, and add up to $200 billion to the domestic economy. Again, something that could actually outweigh the cost of the US trade tariffs. Now, does all this mean that Canada will be able to replace US trade and become fully self-sufficient by removing these internal trade barriers? Well, no. The truth is Canada currently still relies pretty heavily on the United States given the different industries and infrastructure that we have in the two countries. With oil being a key example of this, Canada produces more oil than its refineries consume, with the vast majority of this excess going to the US given the current pipeline infrastructure. Meanwhile, the United States relies very heavily on Canada for potash, for example, which is a key component of fertilizer. So really in both countries, there's no ability to just flip a switch and suddenly become self-sufficient without the long-term infrastructure investments that will be needed. But regardless of how trade relations with the United States ultimately shake out, it goes to show that there's a lot to be gained by removing the red tape and bureaucracy that exists within Canada and ultimately allowing more trade between fellow Canadians. And in the same way our country is advocating for free trade between international partners, we should certainly be doing so internally. Anyway, that's the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it interesting and helpful, whether you're Canadian or American or from somewhere else. Hopefully it was maybe just a bit of a sneak peek of, again, the uniquely Canadian issues we face. If you like this video, please do make sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It does help the channel tremendously. And let me know your thoughts down below, especially if you have experience dealing with these interprovincial trade barriers. Thanks again for watching, and as always, be safe out there.